Hey everyone, Works here. Welcome back to Brewmaster 103, 301, whatever I'm calling it, for the Monk Academy series. We're back into the War Within. Pre-patch event has officially dropped, and I will go explore it here after some time. But for now, I wanted to go ahead and actually get this recorded and wrap up Brewmaster Monk for the Monk Academy series. So, for those of you that have been just following along, I did a part 1 and a part 2 to this. Part 1 covers everything in the spellbook and talents, where we talk about all the abilities that Brewmaster has, its core offensive abilities, its core defensive abilities, cooldowns, passives, and hopefully it just helps you build a better understanding of the Brewmaster kit if you're not adept at kind of making those connections yourself. Part 2, we talked a lot about your talent trees, what talents are good, what talents are bad, what talents are mandatory, what talents are niche, what kind of talents are flavorful, that sort of thing. In this video, we're going to go a little bit into a deeper dive of the rotation, and we'll kind of talk generically about stats and then some tips and tricks to get to know for Brewmaster Monk. Now, with Brewmaster Monk, the rotation on it seems very bloated, and for all of Dragonflight, it really was, because you would have something like 7 abilities that you would always want to use before you would target at, and multiple of them had targeted ground reticles, which made it a very clunky opener to do in like a raid situation or even a Mythic Plus. Blizzard has actually done a pretty good job of condensing the button bloat for Brewmaster Monk so that you really only have maybe 2 or 3 cooldowns that you're going to be using off the start. Now, I'm not going to include my trinkets here, and I'm not going to include the weapon. Now, with this, what that basically means is that I'm not going to include these, but anytime you have like a weapon like Jarun that has an on-use effect, or you have good on-use trinkets like both of these do, both of these are more defensive in nature, then you do have the ability to take time to sit down and like focus more on your normal opener. So what we're going to talk about is both in single target and then in AoE situations. Now, some things to note. I'm using just a standard M+ build, but the raid build doesn't really change the rotation really at all. Some builds will take away a second charge of Storm Stout's last keg to grab something like Facepalm, or go grab something. Let's see, actually, what does my raid build do? What talents am I trading out? I don't remember. Oh, yeah. So a single target build grabs like Facepalm and then takes Dragonfire Brew, which doesn't do a lot to affect your rotation. And of course, I take Storm Stout's last keg. Some people will take it to grab Pretense of Instability. I've seen Blackout combo getting picked. I've even seen like Quick Sip getting taken. Some people are grabbing like Call to Arms or grabbing Heightened Guard if you want to play super defensive. But I just feel like this second charge of Keg Smash is going to be useful. So, if you recall from our Spells and Talents video, I mentioned that Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, Blackout Kick were kind of like your 3 main abilities that you want to have on your most comfortable keybinds. And as you can see here, I play with almost like a MOBA setup with Q, E, R, and F and V being involved heavily. A lot of people play like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then Alt and Shift modifiers. I do have an MMO mouse. I don't know if you can see it all that well here. Hang on. Let's see. So I do have an MMO mouse, the Logitech G600, but it's starting to go on me, so I have to do that. So I have the additional benefit of buttons on the side, and then I have a bunch of shift modifiers. So that's my keybind setup. I might do a video later on about my whole UI. I am working on setting up something new over here, so I'm going to overhaul my UI for the War Within. That is something I will do in the next month. But let's talk about the thing. Now, one thing to note is right now I am using Rushing Jade Wind. Now, in War Within, rather, there is debate still going on and numbers still being crunched about whether Rushing Jade Wind or Special Delivery is going to be a better ability. So I'm going to do this rotation overview based on the fact that right now we have Rushing Jade Wind, because I do think Rushing Jade Wind is generically better than Special Delivery. That said, as we get into higher levels, scaling differences and stuff like that, you may see that Special Delivery is being played by a lot of tanks, and it, of course, it removes another button off your thing, so it frees up keybinds, which is never a bad thing. So I want to make note of that, and as I go through the rotation. So one thing that I always recommend is as you're walking up to a pool, going up to a boss. Here, I'll grab this Raiders training dummy. So as you're always going up to a boss here, is you want to pop Rushing Jade Wind. Alright? And then you always want to lead with Keg Smash. Immediately into Breath of Fire, and then Blackout Kick. This is where you can use your cooldowns. So, Exploding Keg, and Weapons of Order. Smash again, and then you basically just want to start using abilities on cooldown. So Blackout Kick Smash, always there. Blackout Kick, always there. Breath of Fire, always on cooldown. If you're running Rushing Jade Wind, use it all the time. You can even use something like Chi Burst, which does decent damage, but in single target situations, it's not really there. And then when you don't have anything else to press, you can press Tiger Palm. Now, Tiger Palm does have some pretty powerful applications here. And as you can see, I'm not even really going that hard. I'm not using, I'm not like perfectly using my GCDs and stuff. And you can see we're doing decent damage here. So the main thing that you want to keep an eye out for here is, Keg Smash on cooldown, Breath of Fire on cooldown, Blackout Kick on cooldown, Rising Sun Kick on cooldown. That's your core 4-button rotation. Cooldowns like Exploding Keg and Weapons of Order, use them as often as you can. And then combine that with any on-use trinkets or anything like that. If you're running Rushing Jade Wind, use it when you can. As you can see, its duration for me is about 8 seconds, but its cooldown is only about 5 seconds, which means you should have 100% uptime of it. Now, is it going to fall because you got other things that you're pushing? Yes. And in builds where you run Special Delivery, which I'll show you here. So when you're running Special Delivery, what happens is that when you drink from a brew, let's see, is this the one that attacks back? Let me see. There it is. This is the one that attacks back. So Special Delivery has this chance right there. You saw that Kick Smash happen. You see this keg goes up, and then it's coming down. So Keg Smash does have the ability to, or Special Delivery does have the chance to miss, but it does a big, it does a decent amount of damage. It does 28,000 to every enemy. This one does 41,000 damage to all enemies. So like I said, right now, just Rushing Jade Wind is better. That's just where we're at with it. So that's kind of the deal that we are at right now in that. But again, over time, Special Delivery might see its play. So again, just to explain the rotation, it's Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, Blackout Kick, Rising Sun Kick. That is the order of your core rotation. Things like Exploding Keg and Weapons of Order, you want to use on cooldown. So let me work on resetting everything, except the cooldowns. I'm not worried about those. So let's get everything set up. So I'm going to play this a little bit quick. I think I have the action tracker. Do I have the action tracker? I do have it. Let's update this. Alright, so I'm just going to put this right here for now so you can see it. And I'm going to make it nice and big. So pay attention here as I go through the rotation. I'm still stuck in combat for some reason. Whatever, I'll just go with Special Delivery. Okay, so let's kind of see what you do for a while there. So as you can see, it's as you go through this action tracker and you see it's Keg Smash quite often. In this build with with Rushing Jade Wind not being there to fill the rotation, you do use Tiger Palm quite a bit more as the way to fill the rotation. And of course, Blackout Kick and Rising Sun Kick on cooldown. So you can rewind this video, just watch it, and kind of see the priority there. I'm not going to say I'm playing it perfect or anything like that, but it is one that I definitely do recommend. I prefer to go this route with it, but and I'll work on fixing that. I used to have this up all the time on my thing. I think I put it like right here. It's in the way of my camera, right there. Usually have it right here so you can see it. Let me lock that frame there. So you can always see this now that I've got this back up and fixed. Now I use, like I said, I use icons because that's just how I prefer the look, but basically what we're looking at in this situation is, you know, maintaining those small amounts of things. Why do I have... I like this little bit of stagger that keeps ticking. There we go. Finally reset. So, that's kind of the basics of the rotation. Now, let's look at stats. And I'm going to pull up this add-on I have called Narcissist because it just shows it a little bit better. Alright, so when we talk about stats, and again, this is all subject to change. They could change some tuning things. All of a sudden, things are going to look very different here over the next few weeks. Excuse me. But, generally speaking, when you're looking at a more defensive-oriented build, which generally speaking early in the expansion, it's good to have until you start to outgear content, crit, mastery, and versatility are all going to be relatively equal. Now, I'm running a very heavy crit verse because they changed some item scaling, so I've like blown up in total crit and verse versus mastering. And then haste is something that, as a Brewmaster monk, it has some small impacts. Like I made some notes here, so kind of talking about each stat individually will go in there. But haste does have some impacts, but it's not a stat that you really prioritize, which makes it really one of very few specs in the game that doesn't really like haste. Rogue is one, Frail Druid kind of is one, although they've changed that a lot to make Frail Druid scale better with haste over the course of Dragonflight. So there's a lot of things that you can do. So Critical Strike, what does Critical Strike impact? So obviously Critical Strike impacts obviously your damage, because you get, you know, extra damage and extra healing. That does impact things like your Gift of the Ox and things like that. It also affects, of course, Celestial Fortune. If you remember the Celestial Fortune passive, that you get a chance to be healed for, I think it's now 70% of the amount healed on your target. So crit, you know, so right now every heal that I have has nearly a 50% chance to heal for an extra 70% or 80% amount on the target, on me. So crit is very, very valuable. It really helps the Brewmaster stay healed up. It allows your self-healing kit to be even better. And it also does impact in some ways your healing absorbs that you take, things like Celestial Brew, Elixir of Determination, things of that nature. So crit is actually one of the most valuable stats for Brewmaster Monk, and I would recommend, if you're ever questioning a piece between like verse mastery versus crit mastery or crit verse, you're probably safe taking the crit piece. Versatility is just a flat damage reduction and damage taken, along with the flat healing and damage done increase. Versatility, generally speaking, is very good for tanks in general because it's just flat defense, and tanks really need all the defense that they need to live. Now, I'm of the opinion that versatility is not a very interesting stat. I think they need to do something about it to make it much more interesting and much more impactful than just being just flat out boring. But it is still very good for Brewmaster monks, and again, never a bad piece to take because that flat defensive gain that you're getting out of it. Mastery through Elusive Brawler is also a very good defensive stat because as you get more mastery, you gain that increased chance to dodge and you gain that increased attack power, so defensive and offensive benefit. Now, if you're trying to push for like a very heavy offensive-oriented stat distribution, then Mastery is going to fall behind crit and verse a little bit, but it's still going to be decent. All right, and then haste, of course, does do things like affect your attack speed, energy regeneration, and it has some impacts on cooldowns as well. So let's talk about every stat individually now that we've kind of gone over how valuable they are in terms of priority. Some other notes, rather, about these stats. Versatility, like I said, it's just a flat damage boost. Now, with Mastery, the big thing about our Mastery is that you also need to make note of the fact that you do have the ability to go over 100% dodge with Blackout Kick, giving you this increased dodge chance. So if you have a high dodge chance already, which I mean, right now I'm sitting at 22% before you gain the extra stacks, and every stack does give you that 25% dodge. So if you get 2 or 3 stacks, all of a sudden you're sitting very, very high in your dodge. Right? So in that case, what we're looking at is, do you want to be mindful of it? So Mastery does eventually have, it's generally speaking, a much higher diminishing return capability, or a much earlier diminishing return capability than Versatility or Crit has. But that said, for like a defensive build, anytime you can do anything to mitigate damage completely, and again, there's ways to cheese it where people will blackout kick right before a big tank buster to get a elusive brawler stack so that they can hopefully dodge a tank buster mechanic completely, which most of them you actually can do, at least in Dragonflight you could. We're still determining that for the War Within. So basically, like, Mastery is good as a defensive stack because anything can be dodged. Some extra notes on haste. So I mentioned haste increases attack speed and energy regeneration, and I mentioned it also affects cooldowns. Keg Smash, Purifying Brew, Rising Sun Kick, and Rushing Jade Wind, if you have it talented, all get hasted cooldowns, which means the more haste you have, the shorter their cooldowns are. So generally speaking, at least based off of current scaling, like I'm just barely under the number to get Keg Smash down to a 7-second cooldown, and basically I'm there now. So that's where something like a small amount of haste is not bad. So you don't want to avoid haste. We're not a survival hunter who for the longest time in Dragonflight legitimately wanted 0% mastery. Brewmaster Monk does not want to completely avoid haste. We just don't gain the same benefit out of it that, say, a caster does, or even a two-handed wielding spec you think of, Fury Warrior, for example. Gains a lot of value out of haste. Brewmaster Monk doesn't gain that same tangible value out of haste, but there are small little breakpoints that you can go aim for. How they're going to change in the War Within, we'll have to figure out what the level 80 stat scaling looks like. There's still some numbers being crunched on it, last I checked. And I'll look into it more as we get closer to level 80, and that starts to become much more relevant. So, that's what I've got for stats. So, again, Crit, Verse, really powerful for both offensive and defensive stat setups. Mastery good for a defensive setup, and loses some value for an offensive setup, but still very good. And then generally speaking, you're not going to be chasing haste often. If a piece... The other thing about Brewmaster gearing is that, in reality, if an eye level piece is like 10 item levels higher than what you have now, chances are, regardless of stats, it's going to be better. Because the sheer stamina boost and the sheer agility boost are going to outweigh the secondary stat benefits that you gain. A lot of people put a heavy focus on secondary stats and feel like they have to be perfect gearing the entire way that they're leveling or that they're gearing up. And the result of that is just simply not true. People will purposely gimp their eye level in order to make sure that they're maintaining a perfect stat balance or perfect stat priority. And that's just not the case. In almost every spec in WoW, and this is true for Brewmaster, if the item is 10 or more item levels, typically, for tanks it's about 10, DPS sometimes it's 15. On armor pieces, now this does not include rings, necks, and trinkets, that's a whole different conversation. But on item pieces, armor pieces, if it's 10 or more item levels, regardless of whatever secondary stats are on it, use it. These secondary stats really only start to become really impactful when you're comparing similar item level of pieces. So for example, if I get a 528, let's say a 528 leg piece that has haste verse, that's when I start comparing, okay, does my verse mastery piece work better, or does this haste verse piece work better? Now, one thing that you can't do as a Brewmaster, at least effectively, is you can't sim your defensive value. There's no way to sim it. You can sim for your damage components through raid bots, and you can, just like healers can sim through their healing output through Questionably Epic. There's no way to do a defensive sim. So with tanks, it's a little bit weirder in that you can sim for your damage, but you also have to consider how are you going to live. And that's why something like 10 item levels is a pretty good standard for tanks to think about. So as you're leveling up and as you start to replace some of your Dragonflight gear, just know that if it's more than 10 item levels, just take it. Just take it and use it. And as you're gearing up and prepping your character for the first raid tier, Again, if you get an item, even if it's not perfect stats, it's 10 item levels or more, just take it. You're going to gain more benefit. You will do more damage. You will be tankier by doing that. So I always like to make that caveat because you don't always have to is that you don't always have to like hard focus secondary stats. People put too much emphasis on them a lot of the time. Particularly when you're fresh into an expansion, you're fresh leveling a character, you're fresh gearing a character, just take the damn item level. Okay. So let's move on. Let's talk about some basic tips and tricks that I've learned over my time of playing Brewmaster Monk. Now, some of these are going to be general tanking tips, and some of these are going to be very specific to Brewmaster. So general tanking tips, one thing that you always want to avoid is mobs being behind you. So one of the things that can happen with mobs standing behind you is that there's what's called, you'll hear a lot of people call it back hitting. So when you're in the combat with a mob and you're in front of them, you have the full ability to be able to dodge hits and stuff like that. You can see I'm dodging, taking on very little with my stamina. But if I turn around, notice I'm starting to take damage on a much more consistent basis. Like I'm already down well below. And that's because when a mob is behind you, it cannot be dodged, parried, blocked, anything like that. So as you can see, my damage intake is much more consistent. When I turn back around, all of a sudden, we're doing okay. You can see the damage, my health percentage has steadied out. Right? So there are definitely things that will impact that. So when you're tanking mobs, never turn your back if you can help it. Now, in raid situations, this is very easy. Unless you're trying to wipe, you can turn around and take back hits in order to wipe faster. But in Mythic Plus scenarios, never let a mob behind you. In that case, if a mob gets behind you, you always want to do these little stutter stepping techniques so that you're not moving out of like your Warlock's Rain of Fire or your Mage's Blizzard or your Death Knight's D&D. You know, you still want to respect the ground effects that your DPS have on the ground or that are ground targeted, but you always want to readjust your positioning a little bit. That's why you see a lot of tanks will have markers on their heads. It's so the DPS can see where the tank is at. And so that is really because there's a lot of other things that go into it. So sometimes, like I can think of, for example, I can think of in like Algathar Academy with the tree boss, people usually stack on the tank and move, all as a single unit. No Kid Offensive, you'll see people sometimes stack on the tank to do the Gusting Winds scenario in the third boss. It's like there are reasons that people will put markers on tanks, but a lot of the times it's just so that people can always know where the tank is at in the field. A lot of mobs have what are called frontal attacks that are designed to stress the tank without killing them, but will kill DPS. So you hear them called frontals, you hear them called cleaves, something along those lines where people will have these things that happen. So always be mindful of your positioning as a tank. It is actually very important. Some Brewmaster Monk specific abilities. If you're running something like Charred Passions, which is a talent that you get over in your Mythic Plus builds, generally, at least the current Mythic Plus builds, you always want to make sure that you're not using Blackout Kick and Spinning Crane Kick until after you Breath of Fired. And this is just making it so that you can maximize that damage output. Why am I worried about maximizing your damage output? Because threat is a mechanic still in this game. I don't know why. I hate it. I wish it wasn't, but it is. So threat is basically something where a mob has like and there are threat meters that will actually track this, but basically every mob has an under the hood running meter of who's the most threatening. Now, tanks inherently have a much higher threat generation than damage dealers or healers do. All right. This number has been adjusted consistently because Blizzard always wants to make threat a thing, even though most tanks and most DPS and most WoW players don't want threat to be a thing anymore. So in order to maximize your threat that you're getting, it is always good to try and do little tips and tricks to maximize your damage. So Charred Passions, if you're running that in Mythic Plus scenarios, is going to be good. With Dragonfire Brew, as you saw, you get the 2 additional breaths. You always want to make sure all of your Breath of Fires have gone off before you make a move, because you potentially lose value on hitting a target with it, and particularly in single target. Alright, Other specific Brewmaster tips and tricks, as I mentioned, stagger. You want to cover it. This area right here on my screen is where I actually track my stagger. Just because it is the mechanic that everything is operational around. Generally speaking, you always want to lead every single trash pack in a Mythic Plus dungeon with a keg smash. It is actually okay to lead in with a keg smash. Wait until you have a keg smash in a lot of cases. Now, in multi-target situations, if you, we come over here, say you don't have a keg smash up, you can always lead in with a Rushing Jade Wind or come in and Spinning Crane Kick. Because Spinning Crane Kick hits every single target, it does actually give you the opportunity to gain some threat on every target until your keg smash comes back up. Alright, and so in situations like that, it allows you to have just at least threat on the pull, so that when you get an overexcited Ret Paladin, or you get maybe a Marksmanship Hunter that forgets to misdirect, or you get an Enhancement Shaman, or an Ellie Shaman that's hitting Stormkeeper and blowing their big load right on pull, you have a way to be able to make sure that those mobs don't run away from you and instead stay at your feet and don't risk just crushing your tank or your healers. Now, threat is a weird mechanic at times, and it's always something that you want to be aware of. You don't have to go out and get a threat meter to track it, but it is something that I would say, hey, always kind of be cognizant of what threat is doing. It's why you probably see, if you've ever tanked a dungeon before, or if you've ever done a dungeon and you're not aware, like, hey, I attacked this mob and it just turned around and killed me. Why is that? And that's because you had more threat on that mob than your tank had. Now, this is not the Age of Classic where you have to sit there and wait for like 3 Sunders or 5 Sunders or whatever the fuck it was back then. Most of the time, if you give your tank 2 abilities to go in, you can do that. So that's why Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, or Keg Smash Spinning Crane Kick, as you see a lot of monks do. Or if you have Exploding Keg up, you Keg Smash Exploding Keg. And that way you do enough damage that, for the most part, realistically, you shouldn't pull threat. Somebody shouldn't pull threat off of you. So, again, threat, be aware of it, but always make sure of it. Sorry, I was answering a question posed to me in my Discord. All right. Other tips and tricks. Learn damage patterns. I know it seems dumb, and it's like, oh, why should I do that? But particularly in raid encounters, it's really, really smart to learn damage patterns, because then you can plan your cooldowns effectively. So it's always good to have... ideally they would have something in game that would do this, but until then you use DBM or bigwigs, and just know what are the tank abilities, and do things to emphasize tank abilities, so that you can plan your cooldowns accordingly. Right? How do you use your brews? So, for the most part, what I recommend is that for Purifying Brew. For Purifying Brew, and I don't know if this guy's ever going to do enough to me, but for Purifying Brew, what I always recommend is that as you gain stagger, you want to use it, generally speaking, at medium or high stagger, because that's where you're just going to gain the most value out of it. Now, the thing about Purifying Brew is that depending on how much stagger you pump, it will actually determine how many stacks you gain on your Celestial Brew, and it's tracked right here for me. As you can see, I get 1 stack of Celestial Brew, but it has more than that. Right? And so when you Celestial Brew, what I always recommend with Celestial Brew is once you have a stack or 2, no matter if it's low damage or high damage, use Celestial Brew on cooldown. And the reason for that is that you are able to gain more absorb shields through the course of a dungeon and a fight. And a lot of people just want to think on, oh, I need to get the biggest absorb shields that I can. And sometimes that's true. But what I've discovered is that in Mythic Plus situations in particular, once you use your first Celestial Brew that might be kind of small, by the time Celestial Brew comes back off of cooldown, you will have fully stacked it up for its next use, which means you're going to have big absorb shields thereafter. Now, in raid situations, it's a little bit different because you're not always consistently tanking, but in Mythic Plus, you're the only tank. You're constantly getting use out of your Purifying Brew. Now, you don't want to purify back-to-back. If you're at very high stagger, you purify, and it's still high stagger, you don't want to immediately purify a second time. At that point, you're just kind of wasting the stacks unless it's a real emergency. But generally speaking, it's good to space out your purifying brews so that you kind of always have one that's very close to being up, or generally always have one charge that is up. And that way you have the ability to kind of always consistently purify damage and to steady your damage intake even more. If there's anything that I missed, definitely let me know down in the comments if you're a veteran player looking at this. I hope that you've enjoyed the session on Brewmaster Monk, gone over Brewmaster Monk class here. If you've enjoyed this part of the Academy, be sure to check out the Mistweaver and the Windwalker sections that'll be coming out here over the next week or two. And if you want to see these videos early, remember to access my Patreon. These do go up on Patreon first, and then released to YouTube within a few days after that. So links in the description below for my Patreon. I have a $3 and $5 tier. You can join me at either one. I recommend the $3 tier because I don't have $5 tier rewards yet. Extra stuff for people that put $2 towards my content. Until the next video, hope you all stay safe. Hope you enjoy yourself. You're having fun. You keep on gaming. And we'll see you in Mistweaver class.